Hello and welcome to another episode of Chats with Chip. I'm your host, Chip Griffin, the founder of Saga, the Small Agency Growth Alliance, and I am delighted to have with me here Dan Englander, the founder and CEO of Sales Schema. Welcome to the show, Dan.
Chip, pleasure to be on again. Thank you.
It is great to have you on again, and today we're going to get to talk about your new book. Let's see if I can get it here for those in viewer land. Relationship Sales at, I'll take my finger off, at scale. I'm not very good at this, am I? But I'm not a TV host, so I have a face made for radio, and apparently,
Well, my copy's not even at arm's length, so it's you're doing better than I am right now.
Excellent. So you've got the book, you've got Sales Schema. Why don't you just give a little bit of background before we dive into the conversation about the book?
Yeah, no problem. So like you said, I'm CEO and founder of a company called Sales Schema. We're a fractional new business team for marketing agencies and B2B service companies. Been in business since 2014, which is a fancy way of saying we go out and help people win new business, get prospect, get appointments booked, and all that good stuff. Before that, I was the head of new business for Creative House and eventually helped them grow to 7 figures. And before that, kind of started on the account side with a social media agency around 2010. So that's kind of my background in a nutshell.
Excellent. So let's start talking about the book here, because you've got some examples in there of how not to do outreach. And I have to say, over the last, 6 months or so, it seems like there's been a measurable uptick in my inbox, at least, of bad pitches from agencies. Things that are off the mark. Clearly, they're just spewing them out to as many people as they possibly can. It's become very popular for folks to hire outsourced people just to comb LinkedIn and send a generic message out that really has nothing to do necessarily with the target. And so your book is designed to be an antidote to that, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. And I think that like what we found was that there was a time, maybe arguably when you could go in colder and you could sort of represent the new cool thing that you're doing in order to get doors open. But the problem is like with the way that markets move now, especially for any company that you could start with an internet connection from your computer, there's so much understanding, there's so much direct or indirect competition for what you do that really like the barrier that we're trying to get over at the top of the funnel anyway is a trust barrier, right? To take somebody that is even more busy than we all are. We're all very busy. That's getting barraged from agencies that may not understand everything about what you do, but understands by and large the problems that you solve and getting them to take time with you. And what we found is that the things that get doors open aren't so much the ins and outs of a product or a service. It's not the things that matter deeper in the funnel. It's really more kind of human, almost tribal connections that we have either on a personal or a business level that de-risk a conversation. Do we know people in common? Have you worked in the same companies that that we might be working with? Those sorts of things. And honestly, just sort of like setting this impression that you're not going to have your time wasted, that, you're looking for a mutual opportunity as opposed to looking to pitch somebody is really kind of the vibe of these emails. So that's what we do for clients when they work with us is we're often or you are almost always sending emails, sending outreach on behalf of the person that's in that sales seat. But it's really more about finding the connections that they've already built and then using those connections, not necessarily just LinkedIn connections, but just kind of the Rolodex in general to get into the right companies based on trust. So there's a lot more I can get into there, but that's kind of the point of the book anyway. Yeah.
Well, I love that you have relationship in the title, because I think this is something that is often overlooked by agencies who are scrambling to generate new business. And so they really are just thinking about, how do I touch as many people as often as possible? And so you get into a numbers game as opposed to thinking about the recipient of your communications as a human that you are trying to develop a relationship with, so that when they are ready to buy, whether that's today or a year from now, they feel, as you put it, trusting in you and comfortable with you and your agency.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned the numbers game thing because there still is a numbers game. The numbers still matter. It's just the numbers have gotten a lot smaller, and I think that us kind of in the B2B world, and also given that most agencies that we work with are selling to like mid to large companies and they're pretty specialized, the total addressable markets that we're dealing with are not massive. We might be in some cases we might be talking about 4 figures worth of organizations that you can do business with. So our whole philosophy has been, why are you wasting your time trying taking the lessons from consumer marketers that are telling you to, you know, automate everything or over automate everything, yeah, put people through a funnel that humans never touch. Now the scale matters, and we're not suggesting that anybody's going to be writing a custom love letter to each prospect, but at some point, when you're dealing with a relatively small market, the automation can really backfire and can really, just not work as well, a more common scenario, so so for us and our clients, and a lot of like what I've written about in the book is almost like front loading the work of prospect identification and then determining the commonalities that you have. So instead of trying to put people through a funnel, where you're just sort of like automating all these touch points, it's more about like, what if you were to spend more time figuring out the prospects? Just a really simple example that are like in your home, in your backyard, that are in the hometown, in your hometown. Getting fancier than that, like what if you have this giant list of companies, and there's individuals that work for those companies, and then you say, well, what if, I wonder what percentage of these individuals used to work with the clients that we work with. Like we do a lot of work with FedEx. Maybe some of the people that used to work at FedEx have now gone to UPS, and you use that as a way in. So the list goes on, and there's hundreds, of these potential strong commonalities that you can leverage. But what they all allow you to do is de-risk that conversation in a way that's much more powerful than trying to A/B test case studies or subject lines or any of these other things. Yeah.
So you mentioned numbers, and in the book, you talk about Dunbar's number and the construct around that, and you suggest a modification to that. So first, why don't you explain Dunbar's number for those who may not understand it, and then talk a little bit about how you'd like to modify some of that premise,
Yeah, that's just that. Thank you
or
again, Chip, for actually.
add to it, really.
Of course, yeah. Thanks again for actually like reading the book, and I could tell that you did, and hopefully it's been useful. But yeah, basically, Robin Dunbar is a sociologist, and he suggested this idea of Dunbar's number, which is actually like a series of circles of influence that we all have. And the smallest one, and I forget how he exactly breaks it down, but it's something like five very close friends or family. You have 15 close friends, I should say. You have 150 acquaintances. I think that's what he actually refers to as like Dunbar's number, which are the people that you might invite to like a giant party or something like that. And it kind of keeps on going out by triples past that, right? So our whole hypothesis, and this kind of maps with our experience running lots of campaigns, is that on the higher end of that, you have thousands of people that you're not acquaintances with, but who would take a conversation with you based on a personal and or business commonality or a relationship that you might have in common, right? Like the examples that I talked about before: used to work at the same company, went to the same college, from the same hometown, many other things like that. So our whole thinking is, in a world, it's like at the beginning of a Twilight Zone episode, right? In a world where your total addressable market is not massive, and the actual grunt work of, whether you hire us to do it or you do it yourself, or hire somebody else to do it, the work of actually identifying these prospects with this commonality really becomes worth it in that world, right? So that's our whole thinking is, start with your circles of influence, even the outer orbits of your circles of influence, instead of going in cold, and hoping that CMO that you have no connection with it ever is going to be wowed by your awesome case study that thousands of other people sent him or her that day, right?
Yeah, and I think finding the commonalities is so valuable, particularly for a lot of folks in the agency community who aren't necessarily comfortable with doing proactive direct outreach, right? I mean, it's interesting because the agency community is full of people who want to be creative and communicating and helping their clients communicate, but when it comes time to actually do outreach themselves, they're a little bit reluctant. And so, finding these connections can also make it not only more likely that the person on the other end will say yes to a conversation, but also easier and more comfortable typically for the agency person to do that outreach.
Yeah, I think so too. And there are it is a little bit unorthodox, and there is still work involved, but we just find that it works a lot better, right? So a lot of what we do are just referral driven campaigns, and our most successful clients are the ones that are really into this idea, which is that, most of us, especially in the agency world, when we ask like, how do you get your business, how have you gotten it historically, most people tell us, oh, we're, inbound kind of like over the transom referrals and our personal networks and RFPs and stuff. And we used to like wave our fists in the air and say, oh, that's not sustainable. You're ever going to grow your business like that. And we weren't entirely wrong. Just sitting around waiting for a random referral is not going to be that sustainable, especially if you're, like you have a lot of experience with when you're dealing with an acquisition. They want to see that there's something more sustainable. But the fact is, your Rolodex and the trust that comes from referrals is one of the best sources of new business. The trick is being deliberate and focused and building a system that's at least relatively scalable to get those referrals. So a lot of what we do and a lot of what I've written about in the book is how to do that. So instead of just waiting for referrals to come to you, it's like, well, what if you were to identify the people that you actually know, not with fake connections that we all have, like, and maybe that's you have a short list of 50 or 100 people, and then you were able to map everyone that they know who inhabits titles in the accounts that you want to do business with. And now you're going to your friends and you're saying, "Hey Bob, hope you're doing well. Working on some BD stuff right now. Can we hop on a call?" You're getting on these calls and you're saying, "Hey, I saw these 3 or 4 people with these titles. Like, do you actually know these people? If so, would you be willing to help me out?" And what we found is like that, yeah, it takes a little bit more work, but if you're specific about who you want to reach and you're just very open and honest about what you're trying to accomplish, people will help you, and it works a lot better than just kind of sitting around. So it's really about like being deliberate about that sort of work that creates green shoots. Yeah.
So this book is an unabashed advocacy for direct outreach, right? You mentioned inbound and some of the other approaches that agencies can use, but you really are a fan of agencies doing direct outreach to try to find their ideal prospects and not focus so much on, creating the atmosphere in which they'll just come to you.
Yeah, exactly. And I realize the glaring, screaming hypocrisy right now as I'm on a podcast to sell a book, which are all inbound channels, which are all earned channels.
Well,
So,
but it
what?
doesn't have to be
Yeah,
exclusive, right? I mean, it means
correct.
that it needs to be an important, if not primary, approach.
Exactly. And our whole arguments, not to disregard inbound or not to do inbound, but in a situation where, again, you have a limited total addressable market, why not build the relationship with the people you can do business with sooner rather than later, even if the sales cycle might take longer than planned? I think one thing that's kind of gotten thrown around that I disagree with is the idea that sales calls have to be last mile. The only way you're going to get somebody on the phone is if they're ready to buy right now and they've read a million articles and they're like ready to sign up. Like, yeah, that's great when that happens, but there's no reason you can't build the relationship sooner so that you can avoid all the commoditization that comes along with them doing all the research that frankly they don't really want to do. So that's one thing to mention. I lost your question a little bit, but yes, the other that back to outreach, the argument for outreach is another one is that a lot of the times when we're talking about inbound, it's being mediated by other people's platforms, by platforms that you don't really own, whether that's a LinkedIn, and you're running ads, or even just communicating with people on LinkedIn, whether it's a Facebook and you're running ads there, or it's a Google, you're running search ads, search like SEO. These are all great, and I'm not saying not to do them. They can have huge payoffs, but I think that the risk to reward ratio has gotten a little bit out of whack since their inception. Like we all know companies that have been wiped out from algorithm changes. In the ad business, it happened recently, maybe for good reason with the iOS 14 stuff. Like it's not like it's an every 5-year thing. It's almost like an every 12-month thing now that a certain slew of businesses gets wiped off the map due to platform risk. So, our whole thinking is that if you're in this for the long haul, if your total addressable market is small, why not figure out how to do outreach, which is a channel that you actually own, so that you can build relationships today and like go out hunting with the spear and never go hungry again. So that's kind of our thinking on it anyway.
Now, are there certain parameters that work best for the kinds of businesses that can use your approach? In other words, is there sort of a magic revenue number? Is there, what about the number of clients that an agency is trying to acquire? Yeah, how should they be thinking about those things before they jump into this approach?
Yeah, it's a good question, and we have kind of like very vague parameters. There aren't a lot. I'd say that we tend to work with agencies about like at least 1 million in revenue and up, and usually like between like 10 and 200 something employees is kind of our personal sweet spot. But I think that even if people never hire us, the this tends to work better for big wins, right? If you're going after, and this is a very rough range, but let's say like 50,000 client lifetime value and up. That's part of it. Part of it is the work that goes into the approach of personalizing. But I think even without all the personalization, the sales cycles are long and costly. And there needs to be a big enough pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. So this isn't the right approach if you're selling to gyms or you're selling to med spas or chiropractors or something like that. There's a whole ecosystem of people that are really good at that and good at like building funnels for kind of like small and medium sized business agencies. This is more for that B2B, B2B to B, all the way down
Right.
kind of thing. Not all the way down. I guess you could sell to like, big company that sells to consumers, but that's the idea. And our whole thinking there is like, at that point when there isn't, like I said earlier, when there's not hundreds of thousands of companies, but when there's like, 4 or 5 figures worth of total addressable market, the personalization starts to pay off a lot more. So that's where this is coming from, basically.
So let's talk about that personalization because you said it's not an individual love letter. I think was your verbiage for each individual prospect, but there has to be some level of personalization in there. So talk a little bit about the logistics of that. How do you do that and do it in a scalable way?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think the first thing is a lot of times like we all as business owners we all have like a tendency to jump onto tactics, which obviously the book covers a lot. I've talked a lot about tactics so far. They're always fun, but the bigger question is who's doing what and how much time is it going to take and is it the best option for the time and resources that you have, right? So in a perfect world, you have a sales team or you hire a company like ours to do it, and then you have somebody else doing this, and that I think has changed a little in a way that is worth talking about. And that the classic way we've been sold a sales team is you have, an account executive who's the closer. Behind them, you have a BDR, and that BDR is prospecting, and then whatever. And then you have an account management once the account manager once the deal is closed. I think what has been taken for granted is just the amount of thinking, of creative, of hustle, of systems thinking that has to go into the BDR's job just to get a skeptical decision maker to agree to have that appointment. So the answer is, how do you do this? How do you scale it? Or the question is, how do you scale it logistically? It kind of just depends on the size of your agency and the resources that you have, right? So if you are, a solopreneur, it really means that you've got to kind of like schizophrenically divide up your do the multiple hats thing and divide up your job into multiple jobs. And I think the first one is the systems, the creative, the hustle of building out these systems, enriching the data, delegating things to list builders. And that's a very different thing than what goes into closing a deal and building a relationship and presenting things and talking through objections, right? So you've got to kind of divide up your time in those different ways. If you do have the resources, then this might mean you're spending that system's time going on Upwork and finding a list builder that can go find these pieces of information and put it into a spreadsheet. But you're kind of dividing up things in that way, and almost like it's this the sales assembly line. To get even further into the weeds than I have, I think another thing that has been taken for granted is the seniority of the person that's reaching out, right? So a lot of the times we've been sold this Silicon Valley sales pod model, right, where you have a BDR that's saying, "Hey, do you want to talk to our account executive?" And I've seen that to varying degrees in the agency space. But the problem with that is, as an agency, you're not selling like software necessarily. You're not selling, any invention. You're selling expertise. You're selling somebody's time. So do you think that CMO is not going to be that interested in talking to your junior level sales employees? So the face of the outreach, even if that person isn't the one handling the sales process, really does matter, right? So if you have a partner that's willing to get on these calls as they probably should be, at least for a few minutes, then that's going to go a lot further than having a salesperson do it. So what we've done with a lot of our clients is we have the face of the campaign who's like, the partner that the outreach is coming from, and what the CMO or whoever is clicking through to see who this person is. They're like, oh, this is somebody that knows their stuff. They've been around a while. They just get on to kind of make the intro, and then there's somebody else that takes the baton and handles the rest of the process from. So that's hopefully helpful, is like first just starting out with who's doing what, divide up your time between the systems processing versus like actually doing the outreach and the closing of deals, and then kind of go from there. And then it gets into the tactics and everything.
Yeah, and I like that you point out in the book and also just here now that it's not a one size fits all, right? It's not a single formula that works for everybody as far as who does what, because it's going to depend on the size of the agency, the nature of your prospects. It's going to be different if you are a digital marketing agency that's doing high volumes of clients versus maybe more a traditional PR agency that's only looking to add 5 or 6 clients a year, but of higher ticket value. So
Yeah.
understanding how those all work into the mix is important, and so you need to tailor something that works for you and your team, not necessarily what heard from someone at a conference or what your neighbor does.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that it's there's sort of certain exceptions to this, but everything kind of like lends itself to being able to charge higher prices, because then you could actually afford to do the sales process, right? Because the fact is, like, the sales process doesn't necessarily go up exponentially in terms of how much it costs to close a Fortune 500 versus a startup. Yes, the Fortune 500 takes longer. Yes, there's more considerations there, but it's not like a million X more considerations. It's just moderately. So there is, that doesn't mean you have to necessarily go up market, but it does sort of encourage getting away from like low end marketing services where you need to do this volume play to make the numbers work. Yeah.
Right. And speaking of numbers, I think one of the really helpful things in the book is that you encourage folks to go back and look at their last year of communications with prospects, and it will help them as they look and say, okay, what stage did they get to? Did I have an initial conversation with them? Did I, have a proposal conversation? Did I send them a document? Did I send them a contract? And really, instead of taking whatever your CRM has for recommended likelihood to close at different stages, instead of just sort of back of the envelope guessing, you can use real data to inform your whole process and understand these things, because at the end of the day it is a numbers game. And so if you figure out, okay, this is how many new clients I need to hit my revenue targets, you can then back that out based on your historical performance, whether you're tracking that in a proper CRM or on a spreadsheet, or you have to go through your email inbox.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that that's kind of like the first hurdle to get over if you've gotten most of your business from just sort of organic referrals, and that really just means you don't have data yet, and it's better just to accept that. But I think what happens is people run into that question mark, and they go in one of two ways. They either say, we're not even going to measure anything, and we're just going to wait until somebody's qualified and whatever that means, and then just kind of keep doing the same thing. Or they do the opposite and they try to measure every little thing in order to make some like overly complicated definition of what qualified or whatever any other word means. And I think there's a good middle ground where you can kind of keep things simple and base your rating of values in a CRM based on just like actions people have actually taken, and to kind of determine that, use that to determine like where you should invest your energy, right? So the most simple one is, have they agreed to speak with you? Have they taken a meeting with you? Have they agreed to a second proposal call or whatever that is in your process? And then have they bought from you? Start with essentially 3 stages based on actions that they've actually taken. And the problem is we all fool ourselves. We use qualified, and if you wake up on the right side of the bed, somebody's qualified. If you wake up on the wrong side of the bed, or you got into an argument with your spouse, then somebody's unqualified, right? So it becomes too wishy-washy. Yeah.
Yeah, and look, I think one of the big challenges that agency leaders have is that they fall in love with their prospects. And so, one of the things that I think they have to get better at in business development is figuring out when they've come across someone who's not really a fit, right? Maybe they made it onto that list of people who will take the conversation and all that kind of stuff, that take the call, but at the end of the day, you realize this really isn't a fit for what we do. And part of being a numbers game is making sure that you're spending your time on those most likely to close and most likely to have a successful relationship. So that's I think a piece of it is working to identify those things that are red flags, warning lights, etc.
Yeah, there's a great sales coach I like named Temple Naylor, and I reference his stuff in the book, and he likens it to an episode of Scooby Doo where you're going down a hallway, like just like looking for ghosts and looking for monsters and stuff. Is like that. That's kind of the idea. Is like the problem is too many of us get happy years, and we just want everything to work out. So you hear something that could blow up a deal, and you just sort of just leave it over there. Let sleeping dogs lie. And then guess what happens is, you go through the RFP or whatever, and you're 2 weeks in, 3 weeks in, it's crickets. Nobody's following up. Nobody's getting back to you. You finally get somebody on the phone and they're like, yeah, it turns out, our partner, he had this other vendor over here. They went to college together, and we're gonna go with them. I can't tell you how many times we've heard a version of that story, and maybe you kind of got that vibe, but you didn't explore it, or you could have found that out, right? If you if you've been a little more focused and a little more skeptical, right? So
Right, and I would argue that's not even the worst case. I mean, that if you don't win the business, that's better than winning the business and then after the fact realizing that wasn't a good fit, because now you've probably got an unhappy client, probably an unhappy team because they're being asked to produce results that they can't, or at least can't do profitably. And by the way, that's bad for your bank account too. So
exactly, yeah.
you've got to do that and not just fall in love with the fact that you may have a new contract on the line.
Yeah, exactly, and that's the purpose. That's another argument for being able to have enough, in the pipeline that you're not tempted to go against your or go for your demons, basically. Yeah,
Exactly, yeah, because if you're following the process that you outline, you're able to be having enough conversations that even if something falls through, or even if an existing client leaves, hopefully you've got something to lean on there, and you're not starting from a standing start and saying, "Oh my god, what do I do now?"
right, exactly, and that's what we've seen with our best clients is that it's a team effort. It's not just us, but because we're able to lean into this level of personalization, they then get to use the prospects that we're getting them for advancing their process, but for also just like fine tuning their process overall. Like one of our best clients is at 1.1 million in about 12 or 14 months with us, from using referral based campaigns to get in the door with lots of these brands. And they've done a lot of work. It's not just us. We're just getting the door open, but they've been able to just fine tune their process over and over again, and essentially qualify people out more quickly, and then just spend a lot more time on the people that actually matter. So another way to think about this. Yeah.
Well, Dan, an interesting book. It's a great conversation. If someone wants to get a copy of the book for themselves or learn more about sales schema or connect with you, where should they go?
Yeah, thanks so much, Chip. Really appreciate it. The best place is just salesschema.com/RSAS. That's RSAS. And that's the landing page for the book. So you can go there to get it from Amazon. There's also all the resources from the book there. There's me reading the first chapter if you want a preview of it, or you can snag it there. And not sure when we go live, but it'll be out on Kindle June 14th.
Excellent. Well, I encourage folks to check it out. There are lots of good practical ideas in there that will help you to do more, to build your own agency into one that you enjoy owning, because that's my whole philosophy. You got to like what you do. Otherwise, what's the point? All right.
Yeah.
Well, that will bring us to the end of another episode of Chats with Chip. Again, my host has been Dan Englander, the author of Relationship Sales at Scale and the founder and CEO of Sales Schema. Thank you all for listening, and I look forward to having you back on the show again soon.
Thank you, Chip.